and an especially warm welcome. We're here in the world-class cultural location of Ithra here in Saudi Arabia. We're in the cinema for some more intimate sessions with a whole range of topics over the next couple of days. So I'm Ollie Barrett, and I'm honoured to be hosting these sessions. Now, let me tell you just one thing about this extraordinary set of buildings in Ithra. There are, in the library, over 300,000 books, with capacity for up to 1 million books. And I just want us to bear that theme in mind, because our next session is all around inclusive tech and bridging the gap. And the reason I'm mentioning books, and forgive me if this is an old-fashioned analogy, is that if we've learnt one thing, it's not to judge books by their cover. And whilst we might have many things in common, we are all unique and we are all different. And that's partly, I think, what this next session will start to explore. So I've got two absolutely brilliant guests who I'm really excited to introduce you to now. They're both working on some really cutting edge, but very, very relevant and being deployed as we speak technologies. And we're going to hear all about them too. So I'll introduce them to you formally, but let's get them up into our cinema space here in our spotlight session. I'm talking, of course, about Lutza Ireland and Richard Margolin. Welcome up. Very good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. Please have a seat. Now I'm going to be at a distance waving here for our spotlight session here at Sync Summit 2024. Welcome. Let me tell you a little bit. I won't spare their blushes here. Let me say something about Lutza first. Lutza Ireland, a psychologist, multi-award-winning social designer, keynote speaker, the founder, as we will hear, of a fascinating new organization called UGuides. So we'll hear all about that. Welcome, Lutza. It's so good of you to be with us. Thank you. So really, I think we'll hear that Lutza's approach, data-driven, lots of hands-on consulting experience, including Fortune 500 companies, really on best practices around neurodiversity and disability. So we'll hear a lot more about that. Our second guest, and this is not our first encounter because he's a serial entrepreneur and also a researcher by background. He is the CTO of UGuides, which we'll be hearing about today. Richard Margolin previously has founded organizations including and leading RoboKind, which was a fantastic edtech company, which was designing and building, or is designing and building, facially expressive robots that really facilitate learning for children and families and lots of individuals with special needs. So why don't we welcome them both, Richard and Lutza. Thank you for being with us. Let me ask this. Lutza, your work could have led you anywhere. How did it lead you to where you are today? Were there moments? Were there milestones? How did it happen?
I think there were several milestones that led up to where we are at the moment. I have a background in psychology and design, and ultimately that led me to wanting to make the invisible visible, because with mental health or with a lot of chronic health issues, we are always at the risk of thinking whether it's even real. It's really difficult to explain. It's really difficult for even those who want to support us to really understand abstract concepts. And design is a way of making experiences more wanted and more immersive. So creating something that can be really quite dry and academic around mental health and research into something exciting that people actually want to engage with. And so when it comes to consulting with companies, companies are increasingly finding that, yes, they absolutely want data-driven services, but also services that increase employee engagement and provide optimization for their whole team.
Right. So what's an example of a time when you've said, here is, in your words, an invisible thing, which I personally would love to make visible because I think it would help me and help other people?
A very easy example would be to talk about stress. So, when people talk about stress and say things like, don't worry about it or think positive, it's very difficult to imagine that stress has physiological changes associated with it. And if we cut out the physiological perspectives of all the chemical changes that happens in the body, we are at risk of simplifying something that's essentially a really complex phenomena into something really flat and not multidimensional thing around thinking that there's an easy solution where you just have to do one thing and it's kind of and it will become an easy fix. So being able to simultaneously visualize the physical, mental, even spiritual elements of stress just creates a lot more engagement points for us.
Yeah. And fascinating based on Shibli Hassan's talk from Google just before this to think, are there certain indicators that might precede stress that might then trigger some form of intervention? I mean, I don't want to preempt what you're going to share with us today, but what sort of interventions might that look like, either to reduce that stress or preempt it in the first place? I just want to sort of hit the home run for our guests to see what that might look like in practice.
Interventions, I think, can be fairly straightforward with tools and strategies because essentially there are a number of tools and strategies that exist as a solution. What is very interesting, and this is how Richard and I got talking a number of years ago, is knowing how to apply intervention. Because in all my years of practice, nobody has ever come to me and said, when I talked about deep breathing, oh my God, Dr. Lutza, deep breathing? Never heard about that. That's revolutionary. What people say is, deep breathing, what is that going to do? Or I know it should help, but when I'm in the moment, I forget about it. So a lot of it is about understanding the stresses, understanding that certain situations, certain environments, if we create environments that are ultimately stressful, then people are going to feel stressed. So we need to decrease the environmental stress. We need to know the tools, but more importantly, we also need to give people opportunities to apply those tools.
Right. Thank you. So we're going to come back to this. Now, Richard, you and I first met a few years ago with a guest, a very special guest, a robot, Milo. And that was when I realized you're in the business of actually changing people's lives, because I'd seen the testimonials of families, of children and young people whose lives you changed. I'm just trying to work out how you got into that.
So I've been thinking a lot about this lately since I did just make a somewhat big career change, leaving RoboKind to work with Lutza and create UGuides. And really, I think what it comes down to, I've always been a heavy technologist and researcher. I've always been obsessed with taking technologies and making them applicable based on what the capabilities are today. And the areas I've always cared about have been the types of things like autism, especially in special education, what we're focused on now, which we'll get into, but they're all areas where there's not enough people in the world to help solve this problem.
Yes.
And there are good people out there. And if you create the right kinds of tools and that are easy to use and can be implemented today in the right types of environments where these people already are and exist, then we can actually kind of scale this stuff up and make it more accessible and practical and go from affecting a few people here and there to being something that has the capability to go global scale.
Right. Now, and purely out of interest, why do you choose to do that through a very entrepreneurial vehicle as opposed to with a, for example, global tech company? There's something entrepreneurial in your DNA, and I'm wondering why you choose this path.
Because I like suffering as part of it. But no, I think it's because in a lot of cases, the types of things that I've really wanted to tackle are kind of on the bleeding edge of just starting to be possible. And for me, at least, it's been easier to jump in, build incredible teams, use the incredible people I've met over the years to put this stuff together and then go get other types of support from bigger companies later.
Makes good sense, right? So what we're going to have time to do today is we're going to showcase some of what you've been working on. We're going to take as many questions as we can from our audience here and further afield as well, if possible. If you'll forgive me, I want to ask a very personal question. What you've been creating in the last few years and now, to what extent is that driven by what you realize that, quotes, others will benefit from? Or have there been times, and are there times, when you're designing and developing things which you know for you personally, these tools will help? So it is a personal question, Dr. Lutza.
Thank you. And I think the slide that we have up at the moment is partially the answer to that, because whenever we think about what might help others or what might help us, I'm not sure that there is a very clear separation in there. I think a few years ago, I found out that I was autistic and ADHD, which is of course lifelong. So the fact that I found it out, it doesn't mean that I wasn't autistic before. Yes. But that also means that there have been a lot of instances where I was really unsure about a social interaction. I was unsure about things that often people instinctually know or take for granted. So I've always been the person to ask some of the hard questions. And then people come up to me after meetings and say things like, oh, I really didn't know that. Thank you for asking. I just didn't want to ask. So I realized that if I don't understand something, there are probably another 3-4 people in any group who also don't understand it, but just too anxious to ask. Yes. And so what we were thinking about is how to create products that really explain things in a way that people might not even have to rely on asking.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating, but I'm desperate to hear more about what you've been cooking up. But Richard, just to that question in terms of some of the tools to help yourself as well as other people.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what I've done has started with questions I've been asking of myself and things like that. I also recently was formally diagnosed as autistic, and to no surprise to anyone, but still, I mean, it's, with RoboKind, as I developed a lot of the curriculum with world-class experts from all these different fields and focuses and things like that, it really enabled me to go through a lot of self-exploration and also take my own process, which tends to be more academic than a lot of people, and kind of get the opportunity to dive deep, systematize these, different concepts like social interaction, emotional expression and recognition and things like that. And along the way, help me really learn a lot of these components of these types of interactions and how other people function.
And of course, we're also drawn to the obvious commercial benefits. If you think, the mouse, the touch screen, all initially designed with accessibility in mind, but massive commercial opportunity too. So let me sit back, if you like, with our audience. Talk us through a little bit more about what you've been working on, and we'll be all ears and we'll have questions for you, I'm sure.
Sure. I'll start, I guess. So, I mean, basically what we're creating is a combination of assessment tools, generative AI tools, and kind of reporting and guide building to help people basically learn more about themselves, understand where they need assistance, where they've got deficits, and then provide suggestions on a wide variety of possible tools at work, at home, day-to-day life, etc., that can kind of help them kind of work through, work around, or supplement kind of their deficits, and also along the way help others better understand them and better understand kind of the other people in their lives. I think that's kind of the simple overview.
So this is a great scene setter. So are we imagining here, to what extent is the context at home? Am I at work? How are you framing this just in the big picture?
Yeah, for UGuides, it's really starting with at work as kind of the initial kind of target market, if you will. We're building this for large corporate and enterprise kind of environments where, whether it's a Google, an EY, some of these very large group, enterprises around the world, everyone knows we've got lots of people with a variety of disabilities, a variety of support needs, and that when these employees are better supported, they're more productive, they hang around longer, and it benefits everyone.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let you sort of expand on the story, but look, so in brief, it sounds like this is almost our sort of personal user manual. This is how to work with me, which leads to discovery, education, if you like, presumably not just for colleagues, but also for yourself.
Absolutely. And it's so much like a user manual that it's literally called UGuide, short for user guides. So part of our thinking, because we do like to systematize things, is that it can be so daunting to have interactions going wrong or support going wrong, even when we mean our best. And it has happened to me many, many times that I was told, for example, that I appeared uncaring and non-empathetic. And it often happened in situations where somebody shared a problem with me, and I empathized by thoroughly researching the problem, coming up with, what may I say, 3 really good solutions, which I presented in descending order or how likely they are to work. And so I was very confused as to why I was seen unempathetic after putting in so much effort to help someone. Yet another person who would go, "Oh, that's too bad," was seen as really helpful and empathetic. And it really brought me to really take a more humble approach, and instead of getting into an argument of who's right and who's wrong around how to show empathy, it's the understanding that if I have a problem, I may find that it's more empathetic if somebody gives me solutions. And somebody who says, "Oh, it's too bad," I'm thinking, okay, well, that's not helpful. Yes. But at the same time, I have to respect that another person might want me to put on facial expressions and body language that conveys to them that I understand that they are in pain. Yes. And so that's the idea the user guides were coming from, because I would not know what someone needs unless I'm explicitly told.
Yeah, and anyone thinking of user guides for personal relationships, that is brand extension. We haven't got time for that in this session. Tell us a bit more how this comes to life.
I may venture into one of the demos if that might be time for that, because ultimately we were thinking about creating user guides that are the fun user guides. And think about an IKEA user guide on how to put something together. Not very fun, but it does have good pictures. So we were trying to take the best of both kind of worlds of creating user guides that have illustrations and can increase imagination and visual engagement as well, but also something that has a lot of data and a lot of assessment-based insight, because a lot of people would not know and would not be able to tell you what they need because they don't know it themselves. And that certainly has happened to me in the past as well. So partially, we are creating different user guides that you can use in different scenarios. So here is an example of what someone may share about themselves before they meet someone in the first time. And one of our thinking is always that we need to focus on what someone needs to know to get the best out of you. Yeah. So it could be as simple as talking about our quirks or what we may look like, the body language looks like, what it means, and what might be helpful. Yes. But talking about the assessment part, this could be a more structured assessment that someone can choose and say, yes, meeting someone for the first time can be tricky for me, so I would like to proceed to get to know something about that. But then, and this is where Richard's genius comes in, there is also a more technology-enabled and technology-driven part of it, which relies on generative AI, where people can just be guided around what they might need.
And forgive me, can we go back a slide? Is that possible? Because I'm just not sure how, just for example, accessible these slides are. Hopefully they are. But for example, in the My Quirks column, it says, you know, I rock, fidget, solve a Rubik's Cube. This could be my school teacher talking. What they mean is the middle column, and in that case it says I regulate my nervous system to avoid overstimulation, and then of course that final column is what helps, which is you've described, but just to sort of voice that a little bit, which is in this case continue as usual, let me know if it's distracting. So it's a thing that you might observe. What's behind that, I suppose. I'm happy it doesn't say I'm bored there, by the way, and then something that would help for them to accommodate that or to support me during that. So and presumably this is, and the point is this is very tailored to you.
Yes, more specifically, this one is very tailored to my partner who's sitting in the audience because it's his introduction. But this is very tailored to the individual because my expressions would be quite different from this. And unless people understand how to interpret your interface, at the moment we are kind of under the impression that body language means the same thing. So if I cross my arm, people automatically think that I'm closed off, I'm maybe aloof. I'm often very, very cold. So I cross my arms to keep my body
physically
heat.
cold.
That's right. So these are the different things that we need to cater for, that people don't work by the same rules when it comes to body language and facial expressions.
Now I hope you don't think this is a detail, but I want you to make some progress too. But you can talk about your quirks. Can I talk about your quirks? That sounds a little, potentially, would I offend you? If I say, hey, Richard, got any quirks? I know it's a language semantic point, but maybe it matters.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously it depends person to person. It's not something that would probably offend me personally, but I think one of the things we have been working on is kind of language choice. It is important. It is, you know, there's semantic interpretation with everything, and also, frankly, with a focus towards creating a kind of corporate enterprise focused product, there's certain types of language you want to use and want to avoid. And so I think that's something we have some ideas on, and we'll get better over time as we get feedback from that world.
But sorry, to your point, I think what's really important here is that this is a guide that you are given. So if somebody says my quirks, then rest assured that they are okay with you using that.
My unique features. Excellent. Right, please.
So we might show what an assessment might be like if you're not quite sure what you need and what might help, and if it's also not quite clear how to communicate your needs. I'm just looking for the video.
There we go.
So this one we are talking about an autistic employee who struggles when they have to turn their camera on. And I might just read out, the Star Guide is the chatbot that we have who introduces themselves to discover workplace accommodations. So the person is saying, I'm autistic and have trouble with virtual meetings at work. And they are quite what we are hoping warm interactions, validating the distress or the question, and asking about different platforms that are getting used, and asking feedback if there are any specific features that might be helpful. So this is based on individual choice and responses.
And also, a lot of times people honestly feel more comfortable being kind of open and sharing more with technology like this, because, and there's a lot of research going back decades on this, but the technology's non-judgmental. You don't feel like there's a person on the other end, because there literally isn't in this case. And so from my experience, both as we've been developing this as well as some of the work I've done in the past, sometimes the technology not being human, but still being there, being supportive, having a really positive interface, can yield kind of deeper results, and people will be a little more open and a little less guarded. And so you get to the crux of what you're trying to solve with them and for them much faster.
So what would you say, what would you both say to the most skeptical business leader? They're not here in ITHRA, but outside this space, that says, okay, I understand how this can make someone feel more comfortable with each other. How is it good for my business?
I mean, I think that's pretty simple. I think, back to kind of where we started, technology like this, when implemented well, and especially at a level that kind of infuses into the culture of a business, you get employees who feel more comfortable, you get better retention, you get better productivity, and that affects the bottom line pretty directly. What are the two most expensive things as a running a business? It's having to replace employees. Hiring and retraining is wildly expensive, and then so the longer you keep them, frankly, from a business standpoint, you can amortize those upfront costs over a longer period before you lose them. And ultimately, when it really infuses the culture and you have a more supportive culture, it's not just about the individual employees, it's about the teams they participate in, the projects they're on. All of those go better because you get better results out of them.
100% right. And Lutza, it sounds already like your UGuides is therefore, it's in the business of advising, it's chatting, it's giving some guidance to an individual, it's coming up with guides to educate employees. I wonder about the actual changes that then happen as a result, and how maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I'd love to know how that plays out.
You're perfectly on course with it, because this is often what we have noticed in companies who enthusiastically want to invest into disability inclusion programs, for example, that enthusiasm and goodwill in itself will not create sustainable change. So unless something can integrate into the day-to-day operations, and that means day-to-day operations of systems, the calendars, the different software functions that we have, as well as the day-to-day reinforcement, it can really just be that one of goodwill that fizzles out, and then we say, oh, March, okay, let's do women. It's Women's Day, and April comes around. Oh, wow, fine, we'll do Autism Awareness Month. And you're just basically changing T-shirts and lanyards from week to week to celebrate something different. But what we are looking for here is something that everybody can get involved with, and something that also increases compliance as well as documentation, which is a lot of the downfall for disability inclusion, that if people may have a manager who really cares, but the manager moves on, or the person moves on within the same company but to a different role, if there is no paper trail, if there is no centralized system to understand what the different assistive technologies or even cultural changes that are needed, it can in fact be very difficult to keep implementing something. So part of what we are looking at is making UGuides, the different user guides for employees, a default for every single employee, because from aggregate data, then you can create different team playbooks. For example, this is an inclusive meeting playbook for a product development team. And the more red first row where we say must is it says you must monitor raise hand features. So a lot of people may feel quite anxious or they don't know when it's their turn to speak. You don't want to leave those ideas on the table just because your sales team may be a lot more charismatic and articulate with presentation than your engineering team. It doesn't mean that you can leave those ideas out, or can be a written follow-up, so people have a record of what was discussed and the action items. If you look at any of this, none of that probably jumps out as, oh, that's a great disability inclusion tool. A lot of people just say, isn't this just common sense though? And to be honest, yes, it is absolutely common sense. But unless you provide it in a written format and elevate it to a playbook, a toolkit, a guide, something that management can implement and say yes to, you are losing out on the buy-in of sustainable implementation.
Yeah, really clear. Now, we will have time for questions on any and all of this, but that's another very good example of how, and frankly, this ought to go into every organization in the world, right? In terms of the how-to. How are we doing in terms of sharing what you're up to? I mean, it is very, very interesting. Is there more you want to share with us? Because I don't want to, because I just keep coming up with questions in my mind.
Yeah. So this is a really good kind of example of more of a management focused kind of use case for this. So basically, in this kind of use case, we challenged our AI system basically to help us design a plan for a neurodiversity at work pilot from a manager's perspective. Like, what do we need to do? How do we implement it? And this is, again, specifically back to kind of the meeting guide thing around implementing meetings for a dev team, all of that. And so, a lot of managers may care. They may be interested. They may have heard terms like neurodiversity at work and maybe even gone to a training, but this very specific, here is a plan for what you need to do and how you implement it, is something that our system can help you create in minutes, basically. And the other cool thing is that we've been playing with more and more lately is, once this gets implemented into a corporate environment, we can help integrate not just our general giant knowledge base and data sets that back all of this, but also incorporate corporate specific things like employee handbooks and team specific playbooks and all of that, so that it has the knowledge of not just generally good stuff out there, but also what are the specific boxes it needs to stay within a specific corporate or enterprise environment.
Yeah. And there's a question that emerges from this, isn't there, which is less about management, more about leadership, which is that thought that, my quirks, this is an employee thinking probably, my quirks are my business and I intend to hide them from you in order to accelerate my progress in my career. And I think it takes a certain different type of courage to create that psychological safety to enable people or give people the tools to open up. So aside from the best tools in the world, I mean, what are your reflections on the leadership it will take for that unlocking to take place?
That's a fantastic question. And we have been today listening to some incredibly inspirational talk, and Steve Wozniak as well mentioned that ultimately you are the product. And so our argument is, if we are the product, let's at least have a user guide, because when Apple brings out a product, they have a user guide go with it. And so we are talking about something quite similar, that we are trying to get increased understanding, because if we say that instead of hiding who you truly are, which takes a hell of a lot of energy, by the way, instead of hiding who you are, you could get by not despite who you are, but because of who you are. That's in the best interest of leadership. And throughout my consulting work with Fortune 500 companies, one of the most consistent feedback we ever get is that when there is psychological safety and the leaders model how to share in a safe and appropriate way, everybody has quirks. Quirks can be, I want to have green tea at 10 o'clock every day. Or my quirk is that I love a spin class. It doesn't have to be a quirk that has a negative connotation to it.
And so Richard, and I'm going to open up for questions in just over just 2 minutes time. And of course the answer is both. But for leaders and any organization thinking, look, I want to increase digital well-being within my organization. Okay, I can double down on understanding, as you're helping us do that. Or I can say everybody's interaction with technology can and should be unique and tailored to them. Now, you can't say both, but help us understand the benefits of either approach, because they could have costs associated. They could be extremely time intensive at the very least. How do you make your way between those two positions?
I mean, I think from my perspective, the barrier to entry, if you will, on kind of the making the interactions with technology unique within reason have gotten easier and cheaper. Accessibility tools are built into everything we use, whether you're aware of them or not. If you go exploring, whether it's in the accessibility section of your iPhone, there's incredible things in there that will make everyone's life easier.
Like what? Like, I want an example. I'm sure you're right.
I mean, a really, really simple example. I'm someone who reads a lot on my phone. There's a little feature you can turn on your iPhone where if you double tap just physically on the device, not on the screen, just on the back of it, you can have it scroll up. And if you triple tap, it'll scroll down. So one-handed
Hands up
reading.
who knew that?
Exactly.
This is a revelation.
Yeah.
Good.
So, and that's one very simple example, but kind of going more macro on it. So a good friend of mine helped found EY's Center of Excellence, which now has, I think, 17 locations around the globe. They opened one in Riyadh, I think, last year. At EY, they've built up this organization that's 100% neurodiverse employees. They've developed these specialized interview process, management trainings, all this other stuff. And after a few years, they released stats showing that employees under that program were billing on average 2.5x anyone else in the organization. And as they asked people around the broader EY globally to raise their hand voluntarily and kind of learn more about the program, but also if they're themselves neurodiverse, neurodivergent, turns out that there were like over 6,000 people who raised their hand outside of that program, everything from entry-level analysts to senior about to be retired partners who basically acknowledge, yes, this is me, this is part of it, and this has been a strength, not a weakness.
And it's that flip, isn't it? That the thing that was designed initially to help some helps everyone for many reasons, right? Questions and observations, either tuning in or from here at our Sync Summit. If you raise your hand, we can come and find you. You don't have to say who you are. We'd love to know what's resonated, what's not been said, what's not been asked. Are there things that you would like to hear about that have not been touched on? So if you raise a hand, then we can come and find you. I see you there in about the 4th row in our middle block here. Hopefully with the helpfulness of the team, we're going to do their steps. Thank you. And they're just on this corner here. And I will ask you, forgive me, to wait till the mic comes just so our audience catching up can hear you. Feel free to say who you are. You don't have to. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. This is very insightful. One thing that came to mind is besides neurodivergent people and people like for mental well-being, I think this could be a very beneficial application also to ensure cultural differences are clear amongst people. For example, people from different backgrounds, if they move to a different environment, just make sure they're aware of intercultural differences when working. So I'm not sure if that's also an area that you're researching or looking into, or any other areas that would also use the curb effect.
Yeah, really clear. Thank you.
Yes, ultimately we would like to explore diversity based on intersectionality. For us, disability inclusion is where we got started, but I wholeheartedly understand and completely agree with your angle. I myself am cross-cultural, so I was born in Hungary, lived in the UK, now I live in Australia, and again, user guides, you can take a user guide for a country, which is called the travel book, open it up and say, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. So we would definitely like to implement more around intersectionality altogether.
Looking around our cinema here, and indeed if you're tuning in for other questions or reflections from what you've been hearing, if you raise your hand. Yes, I see you there in the red top. Welcome.
Good morning. I have a question and I wrote it actually in my phone. How can this user guide effectively address not only the technical functionality, but also the potential emotional responses of the users might have, such as frustration, confusion, or anxiety? Thank you very much.
Just to clarify, is that when they are, for example, with the assessment part, interacting with the chatbot, or just, yeah. Right. We've done a number of experiments in this one, and the chatbot has been trained to be validating and be able to respond to people's distress. Also, some of our test users have said that it progressed to the point where it can also direct the user into other locally relevant follow-up services as well. For example, a hotline or a counseling service should the distress get reported to a point where it might be of relevance.
And it's just there, when you say the chatbot's been trained to be validating, what do you mean by that?
Being validating, meaning validation is essentially a technique that is the opposite of dismissing, negating, arguing, or minimizing somebody's feelings. Yep. So it goes along with, for example, toxic positivity sometimes. So if somebody says, I'm really stressed about it, a non-validating response is, you shouldn't be. Just think positive. You've got so much going on. Think about people who have have it worse than you. People tend to feel a lot worse. Validating means understanding that stress is real and somebody's experiencing it, but also not wallowing in it and say, oh, it's too bad, it's so hard for you. It's about saying, yes, you do have reasons to be stressed about, and that's difficult, but we are looking for a solution, and it points towards going into finding tools.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, I can see you raising an eyebrow there. If you do come in if you'd like to. I'm just keen to get a couple more questions if there are some. I mean, Richard, the devil's advocate in me would say you're creating, in this case, chatbot tools to help people understand each other. In parallel, at least, are there tools that help people talk to each other to help them understand each other? Really break down those barriers. Here is tech, enabling them to miss a real opportunity to communicate.
Sure. I think ultimately the intent of kind of the chatbot portion of this, which is not the entire kind of ecosystem of what we're creating, is to have a simple starting point that's comfortable, that people can explore on their own. But ultimately the tools that are being suggested, created, designed for specific individuals are ultimately intended to help facilitate better, easier interactions.
Yes.
And you're aware of my background. I've spent a lot of time historically designing programs that teach emotional interaction, recognition, response, and things like that. So I think we're bringing, both with Lutza's experience and my own, a lot of that thinking into what we're doing. Ultimately, the guide is a tool, it's not a solution.
Yeah, that makes very clear sense. I'm looking for our final questions if they're in the auditorium. You have reminded me, mentioning IKEA early on. These days, devices tend, I don't know if you've noticed, everybody, they tend to come with two user guides. One is the hefty one that you can use to open the door, and the other is the 4-pager, which of course we always go to with the more cartoon-like characters. And it's a slightly flippant point to make the case that actually simplifying often means that they're more likely to be read and digested.
Definitely, but more so, it is about having the choice, because what we are doing here is we can provide these comic book size user guides. And for example, you see Richard and mine about how to approach us after this talk, should you wish to do so. Because often people think about these things of, if I see you after the talk, is it okay to approach you in person? And we want to take the guesswork out of it. But if somebody wants to do the manual, you may use it to have it as a doorstop, but some people might go through it from cover to cover.
Absolutely right.
And we are not saying that one approach is bad, the other one is good.
Yeah.
What we are saying is that it should be your choice, whichever you want to use.
And let's be real about this. You know, my glib comment is the quick, short one to get the thing up and running. When there's a problem, I know which one I'm going back to.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but both coexist 100%. We're in our final minute. So let me say, what would your final word be to an audience here focused on digital well-being, other than, of course, keep exploring UGuides, but to take their next step in really bridging this gap, making more inclusive environments? I just want your top tip to close, Richard, and then Lutza.
I think I would say view technology as the tool set that it is and not as a magical solution to everything. You need to design systems like this with intent. You need to think about who's going to use them and what the outcomes are going to look like. And if you take the time to do that and bring some kind of, ethics and philosophy to it along the way, you'll end up with systems that can really support and enable people rather than it's just a nice thing to point at that you have.
Fantastic advice. Thank you. Dr. Lutza.
For me, it would be very much based on what Richard was talking about earlier with a feature that none of us knew. Stop hoarding technology, stop hoarding apps. We already have pretty much everything that we need. If anything, we have way too much. So it's now about simplifying how can we use the things we already have in a way that it's not creating something new and chasing our tail, but making the best use of things that we already have.
Yeah, it's such a good note to end it on. My lesson from our session is, if we have the tools to understand each other better, we have the tools to enjoy life to a greater extent, to work better, to work more productively in every sense of that word. So we're very grateful to you for your time and also for all the work that you're doing. Everybody, Richard Margolin and Dr. Lutza Ireland, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone.